How far will the government go to control what it fears or doesn't fully understand? Here's a case that should make every American think twice. A militia member, a guy with a past, but also someone who believes in his constitutional rights, just got hit with a federal prison sentence. His crime? Owning firearms. Sounds simple, right? But trust me, the story runs much deeper than what they're telling you on the news. This isn't just about one man, it's about a system that decides who gets to keep their rights and who has them stripped away forever. And if you think this doesn't affect you, think again. Let's break it down. Stick around because this one's going to get controversial. I'm not here to sugarcoat it, and yeah, you might disagree with my take. But that's what this community's about, digging into the hard truths and letting everyone have a say. Let's dive in. Militias in America aren't just some dusty relic from the past, they're a key part of what makes this country unique and free. When the Founding Fathers put together the Second Amendment, they weren't thinking about just hunting or target shooting. They had a vision of citizens who could defend their own communities and themselves against any threat, including one from their own government. Back in the 1700s, a well-regulated militia meant that ordinary people had the right, and the duty, to be armed and ready to stand up for freedom. In their world, the people weren't just supposed to rely on the government to stay safe, the government was supposed to rely on them. Fast forward to today, and you've got to wonder, have we forgotten that original purpose? Right now, the phrase well-regulated militia doesn't mean what it used to. In fact, when most people hear militia today, they're thinking of the news headlines, where the government and the media have reshaped the concept into something dark, something to be feared. Groups like the National Constitutional Militia are tagged with names like extremist by federal government agencies, as if it's criminal to even question what the government is up to. But out in small towns and rural communities, people know that these labels are lies. We don't see militias as threats, we see them as a safeguard against threats, the same way the Founding Fathers did. And in an age when trust in the government is, let's say, less than stellar, that's a powerful notion. Militias aren't about looking for trouble, they're about being prepared for when trouble shows up on their doorstep. With headlines every day about government surveillance, misuse of power, and agencies spying on regular Americans, many people are thinking, yeah, being armed and prepared sounds like good sense right about now. Groups like the NCM are just carrying on that legacy, ready to step in if the government decides it's got the right to decide everything for the people, whether the people agree or not. Out in the real world, where the spirit of self-reliance is strong, people aren't looking to be controlled, they're looking to stand strong and be prepared. So, of course, the government has opinions on militias these days. And they're not flattering. With events like Waco and Ruby Ridge in the rearview mirror, the feds have put militias on their radar, even tagging them as part of the domestic terrorism problem. The FBI now has teams just for tracking these groups, interpreting every move as a threat to national security. They'll tell you it's about safety. But let's get real, the government's idea of safety seems to come with a whole lot of restrictions on who's allowed to exercise their rights. Just look at how easily they throw around terms like extremist to describe people who are only practicing what's written plain and simple in the Constitution. And once a group gets that label slapped on them, it gives the government a green light to monitor, prosecute, and, if they feel like it, throw the book at them. If you're paying attention, it's not hard to see the pattern. When it comes to militias, we only see them as groups of people who believe in the right to stand up and speak out, and to do so with a bit of muscle behind it. To anti-gunners, especially the bureaucrats in D.C., militias are some kind of ticking time bomb, a threat to national stability. And it is for this reason that they're targeting militia members like Joshua Calston. Calston isn't the type of guy you'd typically hear about in the news. But recently, he's found himself at the center of a federal case that some people say has bigger implications than just one man's legal troubles. Calston is a Mississippi resident, a veteran militia member, and, yes, he's got a past. Before this case even began, he had prior felony convictions for things like theft and criminal mischief. Now, these aren't violent felonies, but they're enough to make owning a gun illegal in the eyes of Uncle Sam. And this is where things start to get interesting because Despite his past, Kalstens continued to stand by his belief that citizens have the right and sometimes, the responsibility to be prepared. That's what led him to the National Constitutional Militia (NCM), a group that sees itself as a safeguard for the people, even if the government might disagree. So, how did we get here? According to court records, Kalsten and other NCM members had been chatting on Zello, an encrypted push-to-talk app that's popular for its ability to let users communicate like they're on old-school walkie-talkies. In those chats, they allegedly discussed plans that went beyond neighborhood watch or self-defense training. The FBI claims that Kalsten and his friends floated the idea of taking some pretty drastic action against federal officials. And sure, some folks might call that a plot, but it's worth remembering that these were just conversations, plans that never actually saw the light of day. Partly because, as Kalsten reportedly admitted, the group just didn't have the resources. Not exactly a Hollywood thriller lineup here. Now, let's get into the main issue: Kalsten's firearms. He had 5 of Tama Taurus G3C 9mm pistol, a Smith & Wesson SD40VE, 40 caliber pistol, a Smith & Wesson M&P 15-22, which is an AR-style rifle chambered in .22, an AR-12 semi-automatic shotgun, and a Henry .44 caliber lever-action rifle. As for why this is a problem, Kalsten's felony record automatically barred him from owning any guns, which makes this a federal crime. The FBI also discovered that one of his firearms, the M&P rifle, had been reported stolen. But here's the thing: wasn't charged with stealing it. He was charged with possession, period. Throw in some extra gear, like a bulletproof vest and around 3,500 rounds of ammo, and the FBI decided they had more than enough to make a case. Now, from the government's perspective, this wasn't just a run-of-the-mill firearms charge. They weren't simply worried about Kalsten's guns, they were worried about what they believed he might do with them. For the FBI, this wasn't about enforcing a law, it was about making sure a threat was neutralized. Their stance is that Kalsten's prior convictions, along with his activity in the NCM, made him a danger to public safety. And so they went all in, pushing for his arrest and conviction to, as they put it, prevent potential violence. But for those who believe in the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, Kalsten's case raises serious questions about how much of this was really about safety and how much was about shutting down the kinds of rights that the Constitution guarantees. In the end, Kalsten was sentenced to 4 years in prison with no parole, plus 3 years of supervised release. But this case doesn't stop with one man's fate. The government's stance and the resources they poured into Kalsten's prosecution suggest they're taking a hard line on militias. It's a reminder that, for some people, the right to bear arms isn't just a headline issue, it's personal. And for Kalsten, it's about more than guns, it's about the right to stand up for what he believes in, even if it doesn't line up with the official narrative. In the United States, there's one topic that never fails to spark heated debates: gun rights. And when you throw felony convictions into the mix, well, you've got yourself a firestorm. According to federal law, if you've been convicted of a felony, you lose your right to own firearms. Congress made this crystal clear back in the Gun Control Act of 1968, which essentially says, hey, you're out of the gun club if you've got a felony record. The reasoning, they say, is to keep firearms out of the hands of dangerous individuals. But here's where things get messy: not all felons are dangerous. In fact, a good chunk of felony convictions have nothing to do with violence, and many who serve their time go on to live peacefully. So, does it make sense to strip away their Second Amendment rights forever? The heart of the debate lies here: if someone served their time, paid their dues, and is back out in society, shouldn't they be given a clean slate? That's a question that divides even staunch Second Amendment supporters. On one hand, you've got those who believe that once someone has been released, all their rights should be fully restored. They argue that if the state trusts them enough to let them out, then the state should trust them with their rights. After all, the Constitution doesn't exactly make a bunch of exceptions when it talks about the people and their rights to bear arms. On the other side, you have folks who think the right to bear arms isn't so easily earned back, particularly for those with violent backgrounds. But let's consider the case of Joshua Kalsten, who wasn't convicted of any violent crime. His felonies included theft and criminal mischief offenses, sure, but hardly the kind that scream dangerous. Yet, under the law, that was enough to keep him from ever legally owning a firearm again. This is where things get tricky. Should the government have the authority to strip rights based on a one-size-fits-all rule that doesn't take into account individual circumstances? And if they do, are they really upholding the spirit of the Second Amendment? Then there's the FBI's role in Khalston's story. According to reports, they monitored his communications through encrypted apps like Zello, using these messages to build their case. Now, the FBI's got a job to do, and they'll tell you that monitoring extremist groups is a matter of national security. But there's a bigger question here about how much power we're comfortable with giving our government when it comes to monitoring citizens, especially those involved in militias, which are constitutionally protected. The FBI's surveillance tactics have long stirred up ethical concerns, and for good reason. Using encrypted communication channels to gather information may seem reasonable to some. But to others, it's a violation of privacy and yet another sign that Big Brother's gotten a little too cozy in our personal business. Now, let's be real here, we're not talking about Khalston plotting a major coup or training people to overthrow the government. These were conversations, discussions that hadn't gone beyond talk. Should what-ifs and maybes be enough to justify intense government scrutiny and surveillance? It's not hard to see how this crosses a line, even for those who believe in national security. And when it comes to militia groups protected under the Constitution, does the government's monitoring start to look a bit more like overreach? There's a reason the Founding Fathers wanted the people to keep their right to organize and arm themselves. And it wasn't because they wanted everyone to put their trust blindly in the government. Khalston's conviction is yet another sign that the government's out to squash constitutional rights. Cases like this one show how the government targets specific groups and individuals, particularly those connected to militias, as part of a broader agenda to weaken the people's right to bear arms. The Constitution is clear: the right to organize, protect, and arm themselves isn't optional, it's a safeguard against government overreach. On the flip side, anti-2A sheeple believe Khalston's conviction was about keeping communities safe. These opponents argue that law enforcement isn't trying to wipe out the Second Amendment, they're trying to prevent potential violence. To them, restricting access to firearms for certain individuals isn't an assault on freedom, it's a reasonable precaution. That's my take, but now I want to hear yours. Should someone who has served their time get all their rights back, including the right to own firearms? Or should the government have the power to decide who gets their freedoms restored and who doesn't? And what about the surveillance of militias? Is it a necessary security measure or just another step toward government overreach? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This isn't just about one man's case, it's about the future of our rights, our freedoms, and the direction this country is headed. Let's get the conversation started.